To begin with, I want to make sure that everybody is aware we are recording tonight's session, and I will keep folks on mute during the presentation. Our speaker is going to be presenting for about 40 to 45 minutes, and that will allow us time for questions and discussion at the end. And we're going to ask to keep all questions until the end. Or feel free to use the chat function if you want to capture your question. Feel free to put it in there and we'll get to them all at the end of the presentation. Now, our speaker this evening is Stephanie Covington, and we are so honored to have here tonight. And this is truly a result of Becky raising Stephanie's name to me as just a wonderful expert in this topic area. And Becky and Stephanie are lifelong friends, and that's how we were able to get Stephanie tonight. Stephanie is a leading authority on addiction and on trauma, particularly as those affect women in prison. She trained as a social worker and a therapist, specializing in recovery from substance abuse. And among other things, she designed the Betty Ford program and has written more than a dozen books for men and women in recovery. Since the 80s, when she began her work in prisons, she has developed education materials and workbooks and training programs on trauma and recovery for both women and men. And she's consulted with prisons throughout the US and abroad on how to help women during their incarceration and after their release. And some of the former prisoners she trained now deliver her programs to help women who remain incarcerated recover. Others have become helping professionals in our communities. And as a result of her work, practices affecting incarcerated women have been altered. So in short, she is a pioneer in her field. Stephanie's most recent book is Hidden Healers: The Unexpected Ways Women in Prison Help Each Other Survive. And if you'd like to know more about her, I've gone ahead and put the website link in the comment section. And for those of you who are at Magnolia UCC, we do have several of Stephanie's books, and I just highly encourage you to check it out. So welcome, Stephanie, and it's a true honor to have you here tonight. And I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Becky, for actually making all this happen. I'm going to be, that doesn't want to work as we wondered. Okay, this way. So I'm going to be talking about this book, but pulling things out of this book so that you can hear what women say. So you're going to hear kind of what I say, but also what women have said. And the history behind this book, the history really started at the end of the 80s when I spent several days in a women's prison in North Carolina. And it totally changed the trajectory of my work, and it changed me. And when I came out of that prison experience, I was totally touched by how the women had helped me manage those few days. Even though I had gone in by convincing the warden and I knew I was coming out, the women were the ones that helped me manage. And so about 15 years ago, I said to a friend and colleague who was a book agent in New York, gee, I want to write this book about women in prison. And she said, Stephanie, nobody cares. So I threw the idea away. The title of this book had this title before it ever had a manuscript. I knew this would be the title. And so when a couple of years ago, someone else came to me, I had the opportunity of writing it. So this book has had quite a long history. And I think the first question is, what do any of us really know about women in prison?
Stephanie, can I stop you for just a second?
Sure.
Because we're seeing you and not your slides. Your slides are flipped again.
So the slides aren't working.
The slide, no. So whatever you had done.
Slides. Marcy, I see the slides.
I see the slides too, Marcy.
Oh, you see the slides in your whole screen.
Well, no, I have a half screen, but I also have people's faces on the other half.
Everybody can see the slides, okay?
I can see them.
Slides.
Yes, I see them.
Okay, disregard me.
Sorry,
We're
Marcy.
I do not.
I'll send you the slides later.
good, thank you.
Okay. So back to this quick question about what we know. My experience is this is probably the most invisible group of women in our country. We don't know a lot about them. They're hidden from us. So there's this sense of invisibility. And so tonight, what I want to do and what I've wanted to do with this book is really make invisible women visible. I believe that invisibility is a form of oppression. And so it's very important that we all acknowledge and understand who really is in this system. So what do we know and what have we learned? Well, we know that this slide says 740,000 women and girls around the world, but a couple of weeks ago, I came back from a conference in Bangkok, over 350 attendees, 56 different countries, and I would guess today that number is closer to 850,000 women around the world. Women being incarcerated around the world are being incarcerated at a higher rate than men in every country of those 56 countries that were represented. And we can see just the 60% increase from the year 2000. So this is happening to more and more women and girls. If we drill down and look at the United States, you will see we incarcerate more women than any other country. So you can look and get an idea of the numbers of women in this country. These are women who are incarcerated as in jails and prisons. There are over 1 million women under criminal justice supervision. And you might say, well, it's because we have a big population compared to, certainly not compared to India, but look at this statistic. 5% of the women in the world live in the United States. 30% of the incarcerated women in the world live in the United States. So you can see that this population is totally skewed in this country. So these are numbers, but who are the women really? And this is a kind of a thumbnail profile. This is an international profile. You'll see the first thing says most marginalized, vulnerable women. I've traveled a lot. Every country I go to, whether it's work or pleasure, I ask them, what women in your country are the most vulnerable, or who's the most marginalized? Who are the women that have the biggest struggle? And then I look to see who's overly represented in that country's prison. And those groups always match. So in this country, it's women of color. In Canada, it's First Nation women. In New Zealand, it's Maori women. In the UK, it's what they call foreign nationals. In Germany, it's women who've immigrated from Turkey. So across the world, the women who are economically disadvantaged, often with families with a variety of problems, domestic violence and addiction. They themselves have challenges around substance use, a lot of physical and mental health problems, little education, and very high rates of physical and sexual abuse. So these are the women we're actually talking about. And if we look at the girls in the juvenile system, we see the same profile. We see them coming from families with poverty, DV, and addiction. Again, high rates of physical and sexual abuse, problematic substance use. And what we need to understand, if a girl's in the juvenile system, she's at high risk of going into the adult system. And the majority of women in the adult system came out of the juvenile system, which should be a clue to us the system doesn't work. It is not a preventative system, it's a pipeline. And where are some of the differences when we look at men and boys? They're the primary caregivers of minor children. They have more limited both education and employment histories. They respond differently to supervision, to treatment, and they commit fewer violent crimes. So even though I do a lot of work with women, and I've done quite a bit of work with men and boys, we work with them as very different populations. They have different profiles, different responses to services. You know, for years, I'm sure most of you know that as females, data was always aggregated. Everybody was thrown in the same pile and they do research, which means they didn't do healthcare research on women. We didn't do all kinds of research on women. More recently, when they separated out girls and boys, this idea that school to prison is a pipeline, we've all heard probably for years, actually that's for boys. When you look at girls, for girls, it's sexual assault to prison pipeline. If a girl in her adolescence experienced sexual assault, that increases her risk of ending up in the juvenile system. So this is essentially who we're talking about. We're talking about working with those who have multiple challenges on multiple levels. And people say to me, well, what kind of programming should we be doing? Duh, look at this, look at the profile. It tells us what the needs are and what really needs to be happening. So that's the profile, but what are their stories? How do they survive? And their constant themes, the marginalization that I mentioned earlier, as well as abuse and trauma. And these are themes that get repeated over and over again in women's stories. And it's not like TV. I mean, a lot of people saw Orange is the New Black. I think the book was very realistic. I think probably the first season or two was fairly realistic, but as that show continued, it became more and more sensationalized in terms of both sex and violence. And it's just not what it's like in women's prisons. And so what I tried to do with Hidden Healers is to talk about what it is like. And so what I did is I interviewed over 22 formerly incarcerated women. I also interviewed some staff and asked them about what are the things that made a difference, what were the ways that they helped others, that others helped them, and tried to put together a book with their stories and what they could tell us about the reality of this system. So how I put the book together is we really follow women through the journey of entering the system and then what it's like to be there. So the first part is entering the system and the introduction to, and I'm having a hard time changing my own language.
Don't know how to get to it.
You know, it's called the criminal justice system, but it actually, criminal legal system would be more accurate terminology. So what's the introduction to this? Well, the first thing is there is no single criminal legal system in this country. We talk about it as a system, but we have a federal system. Each state has a system of prisons, and within those states, there's 18,000 local systems. So all of these different systems operate differently. And so one of these sort of jokes friends and I make is if you ever decide to commit a crime, think about where you want to do it, because it'll make a difference as to what kind of sentence you get. So it isn't like there is one system. It varies. It varies within California, it varies within states. And 90% of cases that end in conviction are the result of a plea bargain. They're not jury trials. So we often think because we watch television, everybody's going to court and there's a jury. No, that's not exactly. And why someone bargains has a lot to do with what kind of representation she might have and what her fears and concerns are about the whole process. This just shows you, this is from Jefferson County, Washington. This is how the system works in that county. Can you see why it might be confusing?
Stephanie, excuse me, can you make that a little bit bigger?
No, I actually can't.
Okay.
Sorry, it's a PowerPoint slide and I can't manipulate the slides that way. Sorry.
I will say, Chris, that we will get a PDF of the slides. So you'll be able to see it when we get them out that way.
Great, thanks.
Yep. Sorry, I understand the challenges. Small print. But even if you can't read the print, just look at all the different boxes and potentials of things. That's if you got into the system in Jefferson County, what you would be looking at. This is a maze. This is a total maze in every system. There's getting in, and then like any maze, it's the challenge of getting out with many barriers. And there are pathways for women getting into the system. And two of the major pathways are trauma and addiction. And There was a study done. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, and Marcy had mentioned it to me, and this to me is probably one of the most remarkable studies ever done in healthcare. It was originally done in 1998 here in San Diego. They had 17,000 adults at Kaiser. It was a Kaiser Center for Disease Control mutual research project. They asked them 10 questions about their lives before age 18. For the first 12 years, this study was largely ignored. As powerful as it is, ignored. The past 10 years, it's been more embraced. So let's see what we've learned from this. These are the 10 questions about life before age 18. It was about emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional and physical neglect, losing a parent, being in a family where your mother was treated violently, alcoholic or drug-using family member, mentally ill family member, or family member being in prison. 10 questions before age of 18, 17,000 people. So it was a big N, a big study. They found that if people had a score of 4 or more yeses on these 10 questions, that had an impact on them 30, 40, and 50 years later in their lives. That initially they looked at smoking, the injection of illegal drugs, obesity, and alcoholism. Then they went back and they looked at chronic health conditions. And they found that of the 17,000 people, anyone who had a score of 4 or more were at greater risk of experiencing these things later in life. So it was really quite remarkable. Since it was done in San Diego, people said, no, that's not really America. So then they did it across 5 different states. They got the same results. Now we over 2,000 studies from around the world. These questions have been translated to multiple languages, and they find 4 more yes answers on these 10 questions. People have 4 times greater risk for anxiety and depression, 6 times more risk for problematic drug use, alcohol use, being victimized as adults, 10 times more likely of problematic drug, 30 times more likely to attempt suicide as an adult. I mean, the numbers are staggering, but this is all in the general population. So let's look at what we've learned about women in prison within the same study. We found using these same ACE questions with women in prison settings that you find that the more exposure to ACEs, meaning higher scores, they have increased mental health issues. The higher the score, the greater the risk of early involvement in crime, and exposed to trauma before age 18 is correlated to adult violent and aggressive crime. So we would think from this kind of information that all these prison settings would want to be working with trauma, if not just as a corrective, but as a prevention, thinking about life moving forward. But that's not exactly what's happening. If the women in prison have a score of 7 or more, it increases the risk of having a mental health problem by 980%. Hardly by chance. So again, you would assume with this kind of research data that people would be providing mental health services in correctional settings that with an understanding of trauma. Nope, that's not what's happening. So we have these first days of entering the prison, the transfer to prison, what that feels like, as well as strip searches. So let me read you what one woman said about this. She says, when the van stops, you enter a large spare waiting room with a dozen other women. You're ordered to take off your jumpsuit and underwear and throw them into a plastic trash bin, and you stand huddled and naked, waiting for the officers to come back. One uniformed woman officer returns and tells you all to line up with your hands on the wall and bend over, then squat and cough. You do your best to avoid looking at the woman next to you. You think, at least I'm not being searched alone somewhere. This feels humiliating, but safer. Strip searches are used in this country routinely. If you ask about them, they tell you it's safety. These are not used routinely at prisons around the world. I've done a lot of work in the UK, and at one point I was talking about cavity searches and how they're a trigger for trauma. And finally, someone said to me, "You mean you're talking about searching the mouth?" I said, "No, that's not the cavity I'm talking about." They were appalled. We have places that have scanners in this country that can determine if anyone is carrying anything. Sometimes they don't use the scanners if they can avoid them. They'd rather do the strip search. And this is all about humiliation. There's living on the inside. There's the culture and the environment of the prison. There's the kind of physical space where you're sleeping. Could be a cell for 2 people. It could be a cell for 6 people. It could be a cell for 8 people. It could be a cell for 8 people because they're overcrowded. They've got 12 in there. You could be in a dormitory with 75 people. Just depends on the place. So physical space varies. Language. It's not just what is your first language and the language you speak, it's the language of the prison you have to learn. When they're telling you, don't get a 215 or report for your da-da-da or do the, it's a maze because it's all the jargon, all of the short bits of language. And then there's the language that correctional officers use about the women. I've been in prisons as a visitor where without thinking about it, officers will say to the women, "Come on, you hoes, move along," with absolutely no fear of anything, no reprimand happening. So the language that's used. Safety is a huge issue. Women are constantly concerned of safety, particularly with staff, but often sometimes with each other. So safety is huge. And visitation. Most women's prisons in each state are located in rural areas where it's difficult for family to visit. There are a lot of challenges once people visit, because often these visiting rooms are very bare, stark rooms, hard floor, hard walls, hard edge tables and chairs. People come with children, there's nothing there. There might be some machines with junk food. And often women have to have a strip search to go to visitation and a strip search leaving visitation. I've had women say to me, "You know, Stephanie, I'm a rape survivor. I can't do this again. I can't do visitation with my kids. I can't go through this every time." So thinking about visitation and thinking about, as I said, even the physical space, this is a visiting room that was designed at the San Diego jail here in San Diego. This is very unusual, this visiting room. They have some individual visiting room for families as well as the large visiting room. And you can see what a difference the environment would make children visiting their moms. Secure housing units are another part of the cultural environment. A secured housing unit is really isolation. And this happens if you commit a crime inside the prison. So you commit a crime in the community or come into a prison, and then if you do something against another prison resident or against a staff, you will be put in a secured housing unit. And this is a picture of a secured housing unit. I was asked by this Department of Corrections if I could program, because I usually get no programming. Would I be willing to program in here? I said yes. So I went to visit, and you see these, these things are called therapeutic holding modules. They're the size of a phone book. I call them wired dog cages. They don't like it when I do that. But a therapeutic holding module, I think, is a bit of a euphemism. So they wanted to know if I could conduct a program with those boxes in a semicircle, and the program was going to be called Beyond Violence. I said, absolutely no way. How could I? No, I couldn't do it. What will it take? I said, I have to have space. So it took about a year, and now we program in the secured housing unit. We have what are called restart desks. You can't see very well probably, but the women their feet are shackled to each other and then chained to the bottom of the desk. Their arms are chained, but they have an 18-inch chain so they can write in their workbooks. And we have this gray privacy screen. The secured housing unit has now they've changed its name. It's now called the restricted housing unit. As somehow a name change makes the experience any different. You know, there's this concept of being trauma informed, and something we try to encourage everyone really that works with people to understand trauma and what the impact can be. And here's some pictures of a prison that was just built recently in Ireland. It's a trauma-informed prison. It was designed and developed with the idea that the residents here, the majority of them will be trauma survivors. And look at the lighting, look at the coloring, look at the space. On the right-hand side, that's someone's cell called a room. Okay, the top is a visiting area and the dining room is the lower picture. So you can see from this kind of environment what a difference the environment would make for a resident in this kind of a system. When you're on the inside, programming, finding your program. You're only required to take programs if the judge has required it when you were sentenced. Other than that, you try to find your program. And usually what this means is you get on a waiting list. There are many more women in every prison than there are programs available to address the things that they're really struggling with. A certain amount of program is available, but often not, in my mind, of the depth that's often needed. And programming is seen as a privilege, which means that's one way to punish you, is to take away your program or not let you go to programming. Or we have subtle things. We provide programs in a lot of different prisons. And sometimes our biggest issue is the administration has to, what we call ducket, has to give an okay for someone to leave their cell to come to their program. Some days they forget to do the ducats. So no programming that day. There's a huge culture clash, and this culture clash is the culture of corrections is a culture of control. The culture of programming is a culture of change. And so you've got this control and change clash and conflict happening within the prison. And we would certainly think that with the number of women who are struggling with substance use disorders, we would see a lot of programming in correctional settings. But again, for example, in some of the prisons that I work in, where let's say there are 2,000 women in the prison, they might program 100 women at a time for substance use disorders, when in fact, if there are 2,000 women there, there's probably 1,900 that need the program. And it varies. The addiction treatment and justice settings, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, from state to state. Sometimes it's called treatment. It's really drug and alcohol education. Some people get addicted in prison before they come. And we're also learning that is treatment in prison really pre-treatment? Because recovery and abstinence on the inside may not translate to recovery in the community, because the challenges are different. The constriction and restrictions are different. Living on the inside, a big issue is food. The amount of food, there's often a sense of food scarcity. The quality of food varies in ways none of us living in the community could imagine. In the United States, there are people who have contracts to provide the food in prisons. It is not the food that we buy in our grocery stores, I tell you. So I'll tell you some food stories. When I was in North Carolina at the end of the 80s, went to the cafeteria, and there was a line of us walking through the cafeteria line, and I noticed there were about 5 apples up on an upper shelf, ledge. So I went to reach for an apple, and the woman behind me grabbed my arm and said, "Oh, no, no, the fresh fruit is for the staff." So why do you put the fresh fruit up there for me to see, but I'm not to eat it? So after being in North Carolina and beginning to work in corrections, I learned over time that I did not want to ever eat in prison. I used to think, well, this isn't good. The cottage cheese should be fine. Nope, that's not. How about peanut butter on saltines? I mean, these are things you think are pretty innocuous. No, there isn't anything in a prison that looks like the food that we eat and does not taste like the food that we eat. Different quality. So I had the experience of going to a women's prison in Dublin, Ireland. And the wards are called governors, and he said, I'll send a car to your hotel at 11. And I said, gee, it'd be better if I was coming at 1, because I thought, oh no, he's going to want me to eat lunch. I don't want to eat lunch. So he was very insistent. I just said, okay, Stephanie, just go eat lunch. You'll survive. So you have the customary tour and chat and so forth. And we go into the dining room, and there's a white tablecloth on the table and little fresh flowers. And I'm saying, oh my God, it's the show. And when I finish my lovely salmon lunch with potatoes and a vegetable and then homemade vanilla ice cream in a very sarcastic tone, I said, and what did the women eat today? He said, this, what you just ate. I said, what do you mean? He started to laugh. He said, that's why you didn't want to come. I said, yeah. He said, oh, I forgot to tell you about our culinary program. We run a culinary program, and we actually compete every year in Dublin against other restaurants in terms of quality of food, taste, blah, blah, blah. People come to see the cleanliness of our kitchen. I mean, I was blown away, right? Because I was no way, no how. And the women have very creative solutions about food. Let me read you a little bit here. When I told Jerry I was always amazed at how the women I met could make something taste good from the ingredients available in prison, she smiled. As with many formerly incarcerated women, memories of shared meals are some of the few that bring a smile to her face when talking about her time being locked up. Her favorite home-cooked meals were tamales and cheesecake. A friend she met had taught her how to break down corn chips into a fine powder, then cook them in a plastic bag with a stinger, a metal element connected to an electrical wire used to boil water. For cheesecake, she told me, you need 2 creamers, some milk from the kitchen, and the patience to mix it up until it gets really super thick. Then you put it in the window and let it stand and get cold. If you're lucky enough to have someone in the kitchen, she'll give you some ice. You break up graham crackers you get in the commissary. Then you use some of the butter that you've held over from breakfast to get the graham crackers to stick. And then you pour in the cold, creamy top on it. So it's amazing what women will do, whatever they can find, right? And meals are discussed a lot, having meals together, a sense of connection. In the UK, they have done something very interesting here. This is the Clink restaurant. Now, many women's prisons have culinary programs, but the Clink in the UK actually puts a restaurant in some of their prisons. This is in Style Prison, women's prison. Restaurants where the public can make a reservation and come in for breakfast or lunch. So you make a reservation, you come in for breakfast or lunch. The food is cooked by prison residents. There's a barista that makes cappuccinos. It's served, it's cooked, everything about it. And they also are training the women so that later they will be able to work in restaurants in a variety of ways. And so, like I said, this is in Style Prison, which is outside of London. The Clink that's in a male prison that's in London, it's number, I think 15, no, that's not right. I think it's number, I'd have to look this up, 71 out of something like 15,000 restaurants in London. The Clink restaurant in Cardiff, Wales is number 1 on TripAdvisor. Food, service, environment. So really a very different way to think about what could be done, right? Mothering from the inside. This is huge. Most of the women are mothers. Some of them are pregnant when they come into the prison. So let me read you about about Jackie and her pregnancy. Jackie was shackled to a hospital bed, and a male corrections officer was assigned to be in the room with her. Her mother was on the approved visitation list, but not allowed to be in the room with Jackie while she gave birth for the first time, just 2 months after she was incarcerated. Jackie was allowed 48 hours with her baby before she was separated from him and sent back to prison. She remembers crying hysterically, knowing I was leaving him in the hospital. When she returned to prison, she describes the kindness of her community inside as the way she made it through the pain. They were there for me. They taught me lessons I'd never learned before, like how to put cabbage on my breast to help soak up the milk. They bought extra menstrual pads for me because I needed them and couldn't get help from any correctional officers to buy more. They always asked to see pictures of my son when I got new ones, Jackie told me. Jackie told me that the women who supported her through the postpartum period, quote, saw me at my literal worst, stripped down of everything, and we survived together. My bond with them was stronger than it is with people I've known for 20 years. So the challenges, right, of pregnancy and of having children. Now, in European prisons, all the women's prisons have a mother-baby unit. The first one in this country was in New York. We now have 8 in the 50 states. These are considered standard in women's prisons in other countries so that they can have their babies with them for a period of time. In some prisons, actually, in other countries, I'm going to show you Switzerland and then the Czech Republic, they can have their children up to the age of 5. So this is the unit in the women's prison in Switzerland. A place for the children. This is the Czech Republic. This is a large prison just outside of Prague. Again, is the unit for mothers in order to have their children with them. We have nothing like this. California, we spent probably 10 or 15 years ago, 5 years trying to get a mother-baby nursery in one of the California prisons. Didn't happen, and I don't think it ever will. They even considered children when they planned the toilets in the children's unit and the sinks. Grief and loss. All the women have had incredible losses of all kinds. Relationships, health, children. There's a lot of grieving. And they develop relationships of all kinds. They're mentors. They have love relationships. They have family type relationships, lots of relationships. The other thing about living inside is the health care, both mental and physical health care. As one woman said, the scariest thing in jail and prison is to get sick. So let me read you about this. Donna was in jail for 2 months awaiting trial when she found out she had cancer and needed surgery. During the course of her treatment, she received a long-term prison sentence and began serving her time. She recovered from surgery inside prison. As part of her recovery, Donna was prescribed a clear liquid diet. Prison staff told Donna they couldn't accommodate her needs. They told her she should just drink water. She calls that moment the bottom of my life. Donna survived because the women she lived with inside the prison came to her aid. They took care of me, she said. We got each other through it. Friends close to her provided Donna with soups and other liquids she could drink by spending their own commissary money, a form of gift that's technically disallowed. They made sure she got her medication on time by threatening not to leave her cell until staff responded. On visiting days, Donna's friends would come to her cell before her children arrived and help her bathe, comb her hair, brush her teeth, and put on makeup so she wouldn't look too sick for her children. If she broke down after her kids left, her friends would write her cards and spend time talking with her. Donna survived because the women she met inside helped her, and they helped her despite the risk of being disciplined. And then there's celebrating special days. That's also a large part of living on the inside. It's been amazing to me. We're talking about women who have next to nothing, and they get bits and pieces of things to celebrate birthdays, to celebrate holidays. They're very, very creative with bits and pieces of things. This is one of our first graduations in California of the Beyond Violence The women got construction paper, purple construction paper, to make graduation caps. They picked purple because it's the cover of their workbook. They used tissue paper to make a lotus like is on the cover of their book. So this was for their graduation. And one woman talks about the best Christmas she ever had. And I was surprised when Patricia told me, truthfully, I love being free, of course. I love being with my family. But the best Christmas memory that I have is being in the honor dorm doing karaoke. The honor dorm represents preferred housing in prison, which women can earn with good behavior. Still, I've heard so many women speak about the pain of Christmas inside, separated from loved ones, that I need Patricia to explain how it could be the best. She said, I just remember having this overwhelming sense of community, she said. We were there for each other for the darkest times. And for a short moment, we were singing together, all completely fulfilled in our unity and allowing ourselves to be truly happy. I mean, we were singing karaoke, singing awfully, singing off pitch, and just enjoying every minute of it. 2 women painted a mural on butcher paper of children making a snowman in the snow. We had an all-day Christmas event inside the dorm to force people to leave their room, she recalled. We had a gift exchange first thing in the morning, and people spent weeks making their gifts. They saved Dorito bags, washed them, and turned them inside out to make bows for wrapping paper. So amazing stories. We've got a few minutes, so I'm going to go quickly through some of these slides. The journey home. The women have gate fever, is what it's called. Thinking about getting home. They have a dream. Most of these dreams are based in fantasy, what they see about where they're going to be living, about their relationships with their children, with family members. Parole is expected, very difficult to manage all the requirements of parole. We talk about reentry a lot in this country. I think the word reentry is kind of interesting. Same word we use for astronauts coming back from outer space. And I think for many women, that's what it's like. They come back into community having been gone, and think about what it would be like to be out of your community for 30 years and then come back. And how would you manage the world as it is today? We also know that what the women need that would keep them out of prison, we don't give to them, which would be prevention. It's what we give to them now, sometimes called reentry. But what it would be like if this was your reentry? This is Hope Street in England. This was built as an alternative to incarceration and for women returning. That's the structure, the picture on the right. This picture at the bottom is a cafe that's open to the community. The women work in the cafe and people come in and have coffee and cakes. And the entry looks like that upper picture. Then there's a garden in between that building. The back building are apartments. And you can see the apartment there on the right. And then there's step down housing also. That to me is what reentry needs to look like. So what can we do? We have to envision alternatives. People talk about reform. You know, if you were driving a Toyota car for 15 years and had 250,000 miles on it, pretty soon your mechanic would say, you know what? I can't do any more to fix your car. That's our criminal justice system. That's our criminal legal system. The foundation is damaged. We have to think transformation. And can we really be inspired to transform this system? We have to ask questions. What does justice really look like? I don't think we know. But what would justice really look like? I think we all can do one small thing. We can learn more, make a direct connection, be a pen pal, hold our elected officials accountable, work on policy change, make donations. use what we have. If you're a yoga teacher, take yoga inside. We can all do something, do one small thing. 2 quotes, and then happy for questions. Dostoevsky, the degree of civilization of society can be judged by entering its prisons. So what does this tell us about ours? And Archbishop Desmond Tutu, when he was going to celebrate 25 years of service, decided to have a mass in a women's prison in South Africa. He said, because women's prisons carry more pain and suffering than any other place on earth. So the women help each other. And a question I think for us is, and how do we join in the help? So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Stephanie. And I'm going to ask you to stop sharing so we could just see you. Perfect. And open it up to questions from folks on the line. We have several people on the line. You are muted, so you do have to come off mute. And if you'd like to just put your question in the chat, I can read it off to Stephanie as well. And I'll kick us off as you're thinking of one. And I brought this up to Stephanie before this is, I have some curiosity around, in this country in particular, the rise of for-profit prisons and how things are different for women's experiences in the for-profit system of prisons. And what is that like?
Yeah, it's not a simple answer. Number one, my personal professional opinion is I don't believe there should be profit in prison. And yet this is a huge, this is our biggest growth industry, by the way, is our prison system. So I don't believe in for-profit prisons. However, I have also worked for for-profit prisons. So that a for-profit prison called me maybe 10 years ago or so, they had a contract to open one of the women's prisons here in California. Would I help them open it? And I went to a colleague and said, what are we going to do? Do you want to be on the team? Do we do it? She said, somebody's going to do it. Who's going to do it better? I said, we are. And so I told the man who hired me, I said, I don't believe in for-profit prisons. So you need to know you're hiring someone that doesn't believe in your work. And I'll only do it under certain criteria. And he said, fine. And it was probably the best of California's prisons until they closed it. But it was a fluke. For-profit prisons can undercut state-operated prisons initially because they pay their staff less because they're not civil servants. And so once they get the contract, then the price increases over the years, and now the state's no longer saving money. It's not a good thing. It basically is not a good thing at all. And we will see more of it now, by the way.
Yeah.
Definitely see more of it now. The private prisons have stepped up to offer detention centers for people who are going to be removed from this country as immigrants.
Yeah. Chris, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I'm just wondering, like Lindsay and Bob and Betsy and people who were there and Sue, several years ago, we had in our presence a group of women from, was it Purdy? Do you remember anybody? That came to our sanctuary and talked to us about life in prison. And one of them became an attorney. And it was just really impressive. And that's why I kind of wanted to visit today to see where things are and how it's going. And I thought that was a really interesting conversation that we were able to have with these women. They were strong, vulnerable, and it was a really cool thing. I just wanted to bring that up. See if
There's
anybody else.
incredible strength
Mhm.
for women in prison. I mean, many of us have said to ourselves, how would we survive?
Mhm.
The same situation, incredible strength. Of the women I interviewed, I would say 3/4 of them now work in a service position in a variety of ways. They
Mhm.
are giving back in their communities in a whole variety of different ways. It's very powerful.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Jen.
So I'm just like, my mind is kind of deep in thought about when you talked about the ACE study and how, this trauma, this layered trauma on children and young adults affects them and impacts them. And then I'm thinking about the women that have children that you said a lot of, and how their children already have at least one, right, of those ACE, like a parent that's incarcerated, and then probably more than that. And I'm just thinking about like what what are we doing? What are organizations doing? What are people doing that sort of break that cycle, or that think about like, oh, it's just the way it is. If you have four, this is kind of your destiny. Or is there some way that we're rethinking about how we heal from trauma and how we help these young people?
Well, two pieces to your question, really. Different states have different organizations that are focused on children of incarcerated parents that do a lot of advocacy work, and sometimes things like getting buses to help them go visit, as well as programming. It varies. People always say, well, what's the best prison system? There's never I can't tell you, go to this women's prison or this, but everybody has a piece of something of the elephant, but nobody has really conquered the elephant, if you will, or been able to master all of that. So there are agencies that work with children of incarcerated parents. There are never enough services. I can tell you that in juvenile justice and in adult corrections, we provide trauma programs for people. And they've been researched and on this population, not just in the community. So we know that they're effective, and we can also show a change in recidivism, because some of these have been 5-year randomized control studies and following people a year out. And we have data from various states. They just finished a 5-year randomized control study in Western Australia. So we have a lot of data from various places getting the same results on what happens if you start to deal with trauma, even among women who've had very profound trauma histories in their lives. People do heal. That is possible. It never goes away, but people do heal.
And I want to throw out there, and particularly Tony, you as a teacher, that there also is something called the PACEs. And PACEs are protective and compensatory childhood experiences. An example of something like that is having a mentor. That if kids have a mentor or they have some type of supportive relationship, having a best friend, that there's also research that the PACEs do counter the ACEs. So there is that piece of that. And if you're not familiar with that, I'm sure that's a big part of what you do on a daily basis as a teacher.
It's been fascinating in school systems that have set up these sensory rooms or sensory corners, where if a child is feeling emotionally out of control or feeling distressed, they can go sit in an area with a stuffed animal or a headphone, a whole variety, and what a difference that can make behaviorally versus the old sent to the principal's office.
Mine's called Cozy Corner in
There
my
you go. It's the
classroom.
cozy corner. Exactly.
Cozy Corner.
Cozy corner. Exactly. That makes a difference. That makes a difference.
Other questions from folks who are on the call?
There we go. Lindsay here. I was looking at your book. We have a few copies at the church, and I was just cruising through your book. And one of the things that I found very upsetting and very sad is that I'm a massage therapist, and I'm also, everybody knows I'm a big hugger. And one of the things I've found very sad was how the women were restricted, or it was against the rules to touch each other or hug each other, to help each other with their hair. And I'm not sure how long ago your book was written, but is there, have you heard about it, or do you see any change in that, or?
The book was written
Because,
last year. It was published.
oh, it was last year. Okay.
Published in
Yeah.
24. No,
Yes.
no, that
Yeah.
restriction, no touch is a restriction well, it's in every prison I've ever been in. Now, the women sometimes do it anyway. Sometimes someone will get off a phone, one will get off the phone, and something horrible's happened with her family or a child, and she'll be sobbing, and the women will hug her, and then they'll be punished. And they'll do it knowing they're going to be knowing they're going to be punished, but they do it because it's what she needs. And the women do all kinds of things that are at risk of being, one is touching, any kind of touch. When the women were making food for somebody else, that's not okay. Buying something in the commissary for somebody else, that's not okay. I mean, there are just many, many restricted, your life is restricted in many, many ways, and that hasn't changed. In fact, when I'm a colleague I haven't seen for a number of years from Canada was in Bangkok, and we were talking, we've known each other a long time, and she was doing a presentation on it's 30 years and everything's the same. What are we doing wrong? Because it's very hard to get change. Very difficult. Very difficult. Particularly in this country. We're very punitive. We are a very punitive country. And just the difference when I visited a women's prison in Thailand, literally probably 3 weeks ago. And just the Thai people are gentle. They're calm. They're kind. And that is played out and you experience in the environment in the prison. Yes, correctional officers wear uniforms. Their tone of voice is different. Their physical stature is different. They're not threatening. They're not positioning themselves. It's just different. It's just different. You see that, I've seen that in a lot of different countries, different prisons. That prison I showed you in Switzerland with the mother-child unit, that prison is run by a woman who was a weaver. That was her favorite thing, was weaving. And so you should have seen the room where she had the looms and the yarn and all the things for the women, and they made things all year long and then had a Christmas market, which is very traditional in Europe, that they would sell the things. And that's because the warden or the governor was a weaver. In our country, you could be a weaver and be the warden and you would not have a loom in your prison.
I work with a woman who is a Thai prison guard at a women's prison, and she just is.
Really?
Yes. I teach international, or not international, but I teach foreign students English, and she's a non-native speaker, of course, and she's just everybody's best friend because she's just a boss lady. It's kind of fun to
Yeah,
her
different
around,
cultures,
yeah.
it plays out differently. It just
Yeah.
plays out differently. But we don't have anything to be proud of. We need to know, no one comes to this country to learn how to operate a women's prison. If they
No.
go visit, it's to find out what not to do.
Mhm.
That's what they come to. We are teaching people what not to do.
Stephanie, one of the things you brought up in terms of how people can help is different organizations that they could financially support. And I'm wondering if you could send me a list of some that you would recommend, and I can pass that along to folks when we pass along your slides.
Sure. It's at the back of the book, but just to make it easy, I can have Laura send that to you because she can pull that out in an easy way. So, she's on vacation, but she'll be back Monday. So she'll send
No
you the PDF on Monday and she'll send you the list of some different organizations.
Perfect.
And one that you might think about, I'm sure it's in there, but I'll just spell out it because I can't remember exactly who's there. There's an organization that's called Just Detention. And Just Detention's focus is on eliminating the sexual abuse that happens inside prison. The idea is if you're in prison, you're there just for detention, not for these other things. And so they are very much working in prisons, particularly around women's safety. which is a continuing issue.
Hmm. And I just want to be cognizant of everyone's time, and two final points. First of all, is that our next learning forum next month is going to be homelessness and the meaning of home. And our speaker is Dr. Josephine Ensign from the University of Washington. And her focus is trauma-informed care and health inequities for people marginalized by poverty and homelessness.
Mm.
And Dr. Ensign did experience homelessness as an adult, and her research is around the concept of home. And so I think it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful presentation. It does require advanced registration, and I did put the link for anybody who's not connected with Magnolia. It's in the chat, and it's on our website, and you can go there and get the advanced registration for that one. So. And then I also want to say thank you so much to our speaker tonight. This has been an incredible gift, and you have been incredibly gracious with your time and your wisdom. And I think we are all in a better place with our insight and knowing about some of the realities out there that we probably never had an insight or an eye into. And that's the first, I think, moment of change. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you all for being here, and I think you'll find next month there's going to be an overlap in populations because many of the women, when they leave the prison, end up in poverty and homeless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So
okay.
thank you very much.
Thank
Have a
you,
nice rest of your
Stephanie.
evening. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Hi, Becky and Bill.